The people who go and engage in those anti-vaccine efforts, they kill children. It's a very sad thing because these vaccines are important. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. They kill children. It's a new vaccines. We could lower that. They kill children. We could lower that.
While the government says there's no proof the deaths are associated with the vaccines, KXLY4's Kalai Chalk introduces us to one mother who is adamant the vaccines killed her baby.
In Shenzhen on Tuesday, the infant, perfectly healthy at birth, survived for less than 80 minutes. The newborn suffered from breathing difficulties minutes after receiving hepatitis B vaccine injection.
They kill children.
A recent high school graduate is dead, and his mother is blaming the flu shot.
Yeah, even his doctors can't agree on exactly what killed him.
This was his first flu shot. He'd never had one before.
And less than 24 hours later, he became violently ill.
China has ordered an investigation into the deaths of 7 infants who reportedly died shortly after receiving vaccinations.
They kill children. It's a new vaccines. We could lower that.
They kill children. It's
While the government says that
So here what we're talking about from birth until one year of age, children receive 19 shots, 95 antigens. Now, what is an antigen? Antigen is either a virus or a part of a bacteria, which are foreign proteins that turn the system on against foreign proteins. And they get 25 micrograms of mercury and almost 5,000 micrograms of aluminum. That's by 1 year of age. Now, between 1 year and 5 years of age, we add in 14 more shots, 34 more antigens. So now children, by the time they start kindergarten, will have had 33 vaccines. And if you look up there at the top where it says rotavirus, it says 0. That's because that's an oral vaccine. It's not a shot. So that's why it's not included in the math. So by the time they start kindergarten, they will have had 35 shots, 129 foreign particles and antigens, 125 micrograms of mercury, and nearly 7,000 micrograms of aluminum. Now, if you keep going and you get all the additional flu shots, meningitis shots, Gardasil shots, Tdap boosters and meningitis B, by the time you've gotten every single thing, so you've done a good job, you've got your kids fully vaccinated from birth until 18 years of age, and these numbers are probably worth remembering. 54 vax shots, 208 antigens, 500 micrograms of mercury, and almost 12,000 micrograms of aluminum. And it's so important, one of the most important things I took away from what Chris was talking about in his talk is how much different ingested aluminum is and how it behaves in your body from injected aluminum that gets taken up by the white blood cells and quite possibly deposited in the brain. Are you wondering why these kids have ADD, ADHD, anger issues, why they're all put on Haldol and antidepressants and they want to beat everybody up and we've got gun issues in schools? Now couple that with bad food, glyphosate, all these different things that are happening, violent video games, whatever else you want to put into their polluted brains that started up there when they were at birth and 19 vaccines by the time they were 1 year of age. So just that, and looking at that, whether you're a physician, a non-physician, a parent, anybody, how can you possibly say that's safe? How can you possibly even, in your wildest hair imagination, go, yeah, no problem. Next slide. Because, and this sort of sums it down, 54 vaccines and the 208 antigens. Next slide. So this is the rest of the story. These are the other 5 parts that I think are worth talking about, and it sort of sums up what we've been talking about up here. Not safe, number 1, is that vaccine studies violate the basic standard of research. There is no double-blind, placebo-controlled studies for safety. Now that's what Del was talking about. We were talking about drug studies, and you had questions about drug studies. But when you do vaccines, the trial group gets a vaccine. The control group is supposed to get a placebo that by both the CDC and the NIH criteria of definition of placebo is something that's completely inert, will not affect the biosystem, and will have no effect on outcome. But what actually happens is that you put a new vaccine out to trial. What the control group is almost always another vaccine, except in the Gardasil trials, they got a shot of aluminum. That was the placebo. Now, granted, I admit I haven't read every single study article out there, but I know that those of us that have looked around, because it will say in a package insert, or will say in a research trial, or it'll say in a published article, placebo. Sometimes you can't find what the placebo is, right? I mean, we're looking around to see what it is, and you have to dig through FDA papers and all those sort of things to find what it is, and almost always it turns out to be meningitis C, another type of vaccine. Well, it gets worse than that. In 2008, in a safety study, now we're not talking about efficacy studies. We're not talking about if it makes an antibody. We're not talking about if you get this vaccine and it keeps you from getting sick. We're talking about, is this vaccine safe? Are you going to have a seizure? Are you going to have some other side effect from it? And the only way you're going to know that is if in the control group, by the double-blind placebo-controlled study of the standards, gold standards of research, is to compare it to something that's inert. In 2008, that organization, the International Ethical Guidelines of Epidemiological Studies, in association with the World Health Organization, they said, well, maybe if somebody's going to go through getting a shot and they're in that control group, maybe we should give them something called an effective intervention, which means another vaccine. Because if they're going to have to go through the shots and be studied and all that stuff, maybe we should give them something that's, they get some sort of a benefit from it. But in 2016 now, the new standards have become that the World Health Research Guidelines have declared that study participants in the control group must receive an established effective intervention, means another vaccine. And hopefully they try to make it comparable. So if you're bringing a new hepatitis B vaccine to market, well, we'll just use Energix B, because somewhere down the line we declared that that vaccine was safe and effective, so we'll just put it over there, and if the side effects are the same, then it's as safe as the placebo. So now even if you get good researchers who say, I really want to use like a truly inert substance, the new guidelines say that an approved vaccine must be used as a placebo. So that's the not safe number one. So that they are violating, and if you talk to physicians or researchers who all hang their hat on being scientists, which I think is laughable, to call a physician a scientist, that's my personal opinion, I think it's laughable. And they say, well, we follow the double, and you say to them that vaccines do not follow the gold standard of research, that in a clinical trial for safety, a placebo is not used. I think it's like their head kind of goes, it's like an eggshell, it just cracks. It's like because it just like so totally causes such complete cognitive dissonance in the way that they think that they really can't believe it. But that may be the seed that you've planted to make them say, that can't be true. And all they have to do is pick up one study and then another and another and another, and they show that it really isn't there. Next slide. So not safe number two is the fact that when they do a clinical trial and they're looking for safety, they only enroll healthy children. So you'll read a study that will say, in this trial, 850 completely healthy children were enrolled in this trial. And the people with like sickle cell and cardiovascular disease and neurological problems and autoimmune things were screened out. So when they do this new study, only healthy children are included in the study. But what does that mean when that vaccine is approved? The pediatricians say that this new vaccine is really great. It keeps you from getting pneumonia or whatever. And they give it to everyone, even though the children who they recommend it for, who are chronically ill, have never, ever been tested as part of the clinical trials. So it is not, so that becomes the next level of experimentation. They call it stage 4 clinical trials. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 is when they can kind of bring it to market. Stage 4 is when they release it out on everybody and then find out if it kills anybody, like all the drugs that get pulled off the market. So not safe number 2 is that the only healthy children are enrolled. Next slide. Not safe number 3 is that as they have these 850 kids in this clinical trial, that they will start to drop out. Not all 850 that were enrolled are going to complete the study. Some are going to, let's say, 50 drop out because they have side effects. Then they get the second shot and another 50 drop out because they have side effects or they just stop showing up or it's inconvenient or for whatever reason. Then they get the third shot because it's usually a three-shot series in the trial because that's just what happens. And another 50 dropped out. So now you've gone from 850 initial enrollees down to 700. The data is then self-selected and they look at what was the outcome on those 700. And they may make some notes over here about these 150 they dropped out because they had symptoms and 4 of them died. But then somewhere in the bottom end of the study, they will say, the study investigators have determined that the deaths were not related to the vaccine at all. Dismissed with a stroke of a pen because they said so. Nobody goes back and like re-looks at that data and say, did those 4 kids die from those vaccines? No, it's like those study investigators are God, and that's what they said. So not safe number 3 is that the data is skewed towards safety because the negative side effects are just sort of listed over here, but not really in the conclusions of the analysis. And anything that was left out, it was just eliminated by the stroke of a pen. Next slide. So not safe number 4 is that vaccines, as you saw from that initial slide up there, those were just dosages. And part of my boot camp course that we just completed, I've got the best students, and some of them are here. They actually came to come from our class. And they're all working on this project for me now that we're actually doing a really big project to look how much foreign matter are we really injecting that includes those 80 different chemicals. So we created the spreadsheet that there's 66 vaccines across the top, and every single vaccine chemical and ingredient and cell line and everything is down the left-hand side. And they're going through every one of the package inserts meticulously, and they're pulling out the actual quantity of each one of those ingredients, and we're listing them all as micrograms. Because when you look at the package inserts, some will be nanograms, picograms, milligrams, and so it's really kind of hard to add it all up, except we're doing this on an Excel spreadsheet. So when we have everything there in micrograms, we'll just be able to total up the some amount of foreign matter being injected into our kids and ourselves. So of those 80 different chemicals, there are MSDS sheets on every one of them, which are material safety data sheets that look at all sorts of toxicities and everything. Now the impact of all of those chemicals on the immune system and the synergistic toxicity effect has never been studied. We know a little bit about aluminum and mercury kind of being together. We know a little bit about aluminum by itself, or a little bit about polysorbate 80 that punches holes in the blood-brain barrier, because now they're using polysorbate 80 in chemotherapy trials for drugs that are used to treat brain cancer. They're coupling it with polysorbate 80 because polysorbate 80 punches holes in the blood-brain barrier so the chemotherapy drug can get into the brain to treat the brain cancer. Well, polysorbate 80 is in at least 7 or 8 different vaccines, and so when they punch those holes in there and that aluminum is in the neighborhood, it gets a steady ride right into the brain. So not safe number 4 is that none of those individual toxicities have ever been tested for safety. We don't have antibodies to see if there's antibodies to 2-phenoxyethanol or beta-propiolactone or any of the other chemicals that are injected, and we have no synergistic toxicity testing at all. None. We have a schedule that we give on time, fully, to every child in a one-size-fits-all. We don't pre-test them for underlying mitochondrial dysfunctions. It's one of the only areas of medicine that we completely ignore family history or sibling toxicity, and we have no testing on the toxicity of the chemicals at all. Next slide. And then finally, not safe number 5 is that every single package insert says that the product has not ever been tested for carcinogenicity, meaning does it cause cancer, mutagenicity, does it break up your genes, teratogenicity, does it break up your genes and then cause abnormalities in your developing organs, or any long-term effects on fertility, or fertility in males or females. Now that we're now injecting flu shots and pertussis vaccines into pregnant women, we don't know if it's causing cancer, messing up genes, causing organ problems, or having any long-term effect on the fertility of not only the person receiving the vaccine's mom, but on what's going to happen to the baby. In 2004, I was at at a CDC conference. It was the first international neonatal vaccination conference in Washington, D.C. And that was in 2004 when they were starting to really talk about all the vaccines that they were going to be given to pregnant women. And the person sitting on the stage says, we're never going to get the OB-GYNs to do this, never, ever, ever, unless we put the fetus onto the injury compensation program. Because we know these vaccines are going to cause all kinds of problems, and we're not going to know what we're going to sort out or whatever. But what happened is as soon as they started issuing those vaccines in 2008, 9, 12, 14, the obstetricians just rolled over and started hammering, giving those moms vaccines. Now, even with pertussis vaccines, you're supposed to get one every single pregnancy. Even if you have a, what do they call it, Irish twins, when you have 2 babies in the same year, mom gets 2 pertussis vaccines, even though none of those things have ever been proven. So to summarize that, we know that there's no placebos. We only give to healthy children. We skew the data to the side of safety just by randomly taking out those deaths and saying it had nothing to do with the vaccines. There's been no synergistic toxicity testing, and we've never had any of the ingredients in any of the vaccines. So the kids now get multiple doses of 16 vaccines. Not one of them has ever been tested to see if they cause cancer. How dare they say vaccines are safe and one size fits all for every single child, adolescent, and adult is safe and safe and necessary and something that we should do. Thank you.
You know, the people who go and engage in those anti-vaccine efforts, you know, they kill children. We could lower that.
Well, welcome to everybody who's coming to this presentation today. That we're going to talk a little bit about vaccine developers, and I put it into such that it's, are they heroes or are they villains? And I think that the general vaccine community, the pro-vaccine people, the doctors and the pharmaceutical industry and probably public health officials and government officials might think they're heroes, and because we're often told that without vaccines that humanity probably wouldn't be around these days and it was the greatest invention that's ever happened. But I think there's an awful lot of us, and a growing number of us, who might say that these people who did all of these things to develop these vaccines might be more in the category of villains. We have not liked the idea of vaccines too much over the years, and we found a lot of things that we would like to change about the industry. So I put together this background because I'm a big fan of history. And I really like to look back at historical backdrops of things because I really believe that if we don't learn our lessons from history, that we will keep doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different outcome, which by definition we know that's insanity. And so we really want to look at where we came from, where we are, and maybe we can make some choices going forward to be a little bit different. So the first vaccine person that came around that we know, as we know it, and most people understand, is Edward Jenner. And he's credited with the smallpox vaccine. So I think that's where we're going to start. That Edward Jenner actually, even though he was credited with the smallpox vaccine, it actually started long before him, almost 50 years before him, before he was credited with the discovery of immunology. But it was really an English aristocrat, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who introduced smallpox inoculation, and she came from Turkey and was from the Middle East. And she was actually the person who would do these very slight little vaccination marks on people because nobody in that age group wanted to mar up their skin. So she was one of the first ones who brought it to England, to Europe, even though Jenner was born in 1749. As Jenner learned purely from observation, that it seemed as though the milkmaids that milked the cows, and they were exposed to the cowpox, that they didn't seem to have all the marks on their faces that would be representative of smallpox. And so Jenner came upon this experiment to inject matter from a cow lesion into a young dairy maid, and then into the arm of an 8-year-old boy, James Phipps. 2 months later, Jenner inoculated the boy again, this time with matter from a fresh smallpox lesion. And because the boy did not develop full-blown case of smallpox, Jenner concluded that the protection was complete and an industry was born. Now, there could have been an awful lot of reasons of why he did not get full-blown smallpox. Part of it may have been a cross-reaction from the cowpox to the smallpox. Part of it may have been that the pus that got injected into his arm maybe didn't have as many smallpox in there. It may have been that Phipps' immune system was just strong enough that he just sort of blew it away. But at that point, the industry was born, and that we started to use cowpox instead of smallpox as an inoculation. Actually, the Latin word for cow is vacca, and cowpox is vaccinia, and that's why Jenner decided to call his new procedure vaccination, because what they were doing was taking blisters from cows and injecting them into people. Smallpox vaccination of the 18th century was not as we know it today. In fact, it was a fairly gruesome procedure. It was invasive, unsanitary, and often even disfiguring. Public inoculations cut at least 4 lines in a scored pattern in the arm of an adult with a blade. And then the vaccine matter from the lymph, the pus on the underside of cows, was actually extracted and smeared across the lacerations that had been put on the side of the arm. And at that point, about 8 days after the procedure, the blisters were harvested and the liquid was injected directly into the arms of children. So mothers came in and had this procedure done and then brought back their babies, and then it was scraped off of the mother's arm and injected into children. The side effects, as you can imagine, were big and extensive, and secondary infections and very serious complications, and things like gangrene and death was rampant, even though it was ignored by officials as necessary for the good of the whole. So that even though some died, some lost their arms, some were mutilated and disfigured for life, this was the good of the whole. And if we could stop smallpox in this community, if we sacrificed a few children along the way, it was going to be okay. So Jenner has been elevated to one of the best known persons in medical history. The discovery of the smallpox vaccination is held as one of the most widely celebrated inventions ever to have happened in medical history. But was smallpox vaccination really as successful as it claimed to be? Did we really eradicate smallpox with the vaccine? Did we really do good for humanity by the missionaries that left from the United Kingdom and went around the world and started vaccinating all of the third world heathens with what we now know as the smallpox vaccine? Because there were a lot of complications to this vaccine beyond just the gangrene and the terrible infections from putting cow lymph on everybody's open wounds. And these were some of the pictures that came from the smallpox vaccine, even the smallpox vaccine as we know it today. I think that a lot of times the pro-vaccine people who say that smallpox was so great, they will show a lot of pictures of what happened when people had smallpox, and that they would show the worst case scenarios of smallpox vaccine, And as a matter of fact, there were a lot of cases of smallpox where people had little bumps here and there in their body, and it was so few little bumps that they barely knew that they even had it. It was only the worst case scenario types of smallpox that created something called hemorrhagic smallpox that people died from. The rest of them, it was more of a disfiguring or a scarring condition, and it was more about personal looks and how people actually looked on their skin in terms of scarring conditions than it was actually more serious of a disease. But this is what the other side of the equation looks like. These were some of the complications of getting a smallpox vaccine, which can be equally as disfiguring and equally as destructive to humanity from the complications of the vaccine as from the most severe complications of the illness. There were other problems that went along with the smallpox vaccine, and one of them was the spread of syphilis. And this is a quote from the textbook that's called Vaccines, and it says that, quote, "As the 19th century progressed, the initial wave of enthusiasm for vaccination subsided as difficulties were experienced, when it was found that on some occasions syphilis was transmitted in the process." Well, syphilis is a condition by an infectant called a spirochete, and the spirochetes frequently were found in cows. So as they harvested cows, and at the time when they were making smallpox vaccine, it was an entire industry. You know, farmers would have entire herds of cows that would be there specifically for which to grow smallpox and cowpox that they would harvest it and used it for the vaccine industry. And so not the cows were out in the field, and some of them were infected with the syphilis microbe. Other problems that went along with syphilis is that as a result of vaccination became apparent, vaccination campaigns proceeded after the passage of the 1853 Compulsory Vaccination Act. Example, the number of annual deaths from syphilis in children under the age of 1 were less than 350 per year prior to 1853, when the first Mandatory Vaccination Act was passed. The number doubled the next year. Syphilis in this age group increased every year until 1883, when the number of deaths from syphilis reached over 1,800 annually. So they went from 380 to 1,800. And the rate of syphilis in adults who were less vaccinated during that period of time remained almost the same. So it was pretty obvious during that period of time that what was spreading syphilis across the UK and around the globe had to do with the smallpox vaccination as we know it. There was another problem, is that smallpox vaccination started to cause smallpox epidemics. As I said, the first mandatory vaccination law in the UK was passed in 1853. Evidence documents that smallpox epidemics increased dramatically the next year. In 1857 to 1859, there were more than 14,000 deaths from smallpox in London. The following year, in 1863 to 1865, there were 20,000 deaths. And between 1871 and 1873, as Europe adapted vaccination, and they used it more and more in other and third world countries, Europe was swept with the worst smallpox epidemic in its recorded history. In 1872, when Japan started compulsory vaccination against smallpox, the disease steadily increased in Southeast Asia. And 20 years later, there were more than 165,000 cases occurred, with 30,000 deaths in a completely vaccinated population, which prior to that time, there had not been any vaccination for smallpox in Southeast Asia. During approximately the same period, Australia had no compulsory vaccination and had only 3 deaths from smallpox over a 15-year period of time. This was one of my heroes, John Tilden, who was, I don't know, maybe I was him in a past life or something, I don't know. But he was one of the people in that period of time. He was an MD during the period from 1851 to 1940, where he was a very strong, outspoken person against mandatory vaccination and against the smallpox vaccination in specific. And this is one of his very famous quotes, where he said, quote, "Smallpox is considered one of the most virulent and contagious diseases, and it is generally believed that persons exposed are almost invariably attacked, unless protected, of course, by vaccination. This is one of the most stupendous exaggerations to be found in the medical literature. My experience has been that very few people take it when exposed to it," meaning that you were exposed to the smallpox virus, that very few people actually contracted smallpox, or if they did, it was a very mild case of it with a few shoddy bumps across their body, and they then became lifetime immune. Now, smallpox eradication started went around the country, and by 1972, it wasn't really working. And more people were finding that they would have completely vaccinated communities, and in those completely vaccinated communities, they would continue to have outbreaks of smallpox. And then the next wave of thing that happened was that they decided that they would quarantine people. And as people were quarantined, they would do some ring vaccination. And over a 4-year period of time, through the use of quarantine to stop the spread, and the CDC would say, through to the use of ring vaccination, that smallpox had been eradicated. In 1980, they said that the smallpox had been eradicated from the planet. Fast forward from 1980 up to 2001 and after 9/11. And after 9/11, they decided that they wanted to reinstitute smallpox vaccination through using the smallpox vaccine as we know it in this country, that's used with a vaccinia virus that's kind of a cousin to the smallpox virus and kind of a cousin to the cowpox virus, but it's called vaccinia. And they were wanting to use vaccinia to mass vaccinate the entire community because of the threat of bioterrorism. I went to the CDC at that period of time to one of their town meetings, and while I was there, I was saying all the reasons why we should not really vaccinate against smallpox in the general community. Since the last case of smallpox was known in this country in 1949, surely, in the advances of technology and medicines and hospitals, surely that the death rate would not be 30%, and that we could quarantine people if there was an outbreak, and we could stop the spread without using vaccination. And one of the other speakers that was at the meeting at that time was Dr. Tom Mack, who had been part of the vaccination eradication program back in the 70s. And it was in his opinion that even without mass vaccination, even in the 1970s, smallpox would have died out anyway. It had already on its way out, it just would have taken a little bit longer. By the late 1800s, even in this country, let's roll the history back a little bit since we're talking about history here. In 1801 was the first smallpox vaccination in the US, and by the 1890s, you weren't really seeing that much in terms of smallpox. If you did see it, it was weak and only a few people had it. Then there was an outbreak of smallpox in inner cities in congested areas in the early 1900s. But by that time, we really weren't even seeing that much smallpox in this country. The last case of smallpox in the US was 1949, and we did a pretty good job of stopping the mass smallpox vaccination, I think, in this country. We really didn't find any weapons of mass destruction. We found that even if a person was completely peppered with smallpox and walked through a crowd, it wouldn't do viral spread. It might go to one person, but that person wouldn't spread it to the next and the next and the next. So in the good judgment of the CDC, they decided not to do that. And I think that it's really, here's another quote from someone who was a doctor back in the early 1900s when he said, "It's pathetic and ludicrous to say we ever vanquished smallpox with vaccines when only 10% of the population was ever vaccinated." So I think that a lot of us have this image that with smallpox and with polio, that there was vaccinators stomping around the world and everybody was standing up and being vaccinated, and we actually eradicated the whole world by vaccinating the whole world, which just really wasn't true. But somehow we feel like if we vaccinate the whole world with all of these viruses or all these vaccines that we have now, that somehow we will be able to eradicate pathogens and that the world will be a better place. The problem is like, even if we were able to eliminate pathogens, what have we traded? What has been the trade-off between decreasing the incidence of measles and increasing the incidence of autism, decreasing the incidence of chickenpox and increasing the incidence of shingles, decreasing the incidence of polio, but still having the acute flaccid paralysis and having people to be able to be paralyzed, but we've spent billions of dollars to eradicate polio. I think that we need to realize that only a small percentage of the population was actually vaccinated with the smallpox vaccine in order to make it go away. And what made it really go away had to do with improved hygiene and better health for people around the world. Dr. Henderson, Dr. D.A. Henderson, is another person who is a very important person from the CDC and one of the foremost authorities of smallpox. He confirmed that there's a paucity of studies about the efficacy of the smallpox vaccine, even though we used it up through the 1970s. It says from the textbook of vaccine that reliable data are surprisingly sparse as to the efficacy and durability of protection afforded by the smallpox vaccination, but yet we continued to use it anyways, even though there was no proof that it worked. And despite the lack of proof that the vaccine worked, vaccine promoters consistently make claims that the smallpox vaccine eliminated the disease, and the truth is, smallpox was really eradicated by hygiene and the use of quarantine. Another quote by Dr. John Tilden, "There is no question that perfect sanitation has almost obliterated this disease, which was smallpox, and sooner or later we'll dispose of it entirely. Of course, when that time comes, in all probability, the credit will be given to vaccination." So we fast forward a little bit and we go past through the smallpox vaccination, and I think the next thing that people really talk about a lot when it comes to vaccines has to do with the polio vaccines. And those that were around in adults in the 1950s, they really remember all the terror that was on the televisions and all the things that they were just scared to death that at any minute their child was going to be contracting polio, and then if they had polio, they would be paralyzed for life. We were all bombarded with pictures of children with crutches and with the March of Dimes and all the things that were happening to keep children from being paralyzed and not being able to go swimming in the summer and to stay out of swimming pools because they thought that's maybe where the virus came from. Well, all of that was happening in the forefront, and all of the development of the vaccine between the Salk vaccine, which is the injectable polio vaccine, and the Sabin vaccine, which is the oral drops, was all happening in the background with government money. So we're going to talk just a little bit about the polio vaccines. And truth is that before we talk about the vaccines, the first thing we're going to talk about a little bit has to do with about polio infections. That more than 90% of people who were exposed to polio had just a simple gastrointestinal infection. Symptoms would develop after 3 to 5 days. It would look like a mild stomach flu, get some vomiting, maybe diarrhea. They would have recovery in 24 to 72 hours and have a lifetime of immunity. So, and less than 2% of all people that were infected by the gastrointestinal virus polio would actually go on and have some level of paralysis. There are 3 different types of paralysis. The spinal paralysis is one that's just it affected an extremity, an arm or a leg. The bulbar polio is the one that would affect the breathing centers of the brain and would have a problem with the diaphragm. So it's actually just 2% of the 2%, so 0.04% is the amount of people who actually had a serious enough polio that they probably died from it, or whichever portion of the population ended up on an iron lung machine, because those statistics don't seem to be readily available. Even if you had paralysis from polio, more than 50% of the people that had paralysis completely recovered. And whatever losses they had over a 12-month period of time seemed to be a little bit more permanent, and functionally they could still improve for about 2 years. So the take-home message from that is that paralysis and polio are not synonyms. People can have polio and most people completely recovered from it. In terms of paralysis, there are other types of viruses out there that can cause people to have paralysis. But we are so focused and terrified of the polio virus that we are spending billions and billions of dollars in third world countries that could much better be served with those monies with portable water and good quality food and education than by trying to eradicate a virus that by eradicating polio will not eradicate paralysis. So when the polio vaccine came about, the injectable vaccine was released in 1955. It was developed by Dr. Jonas Salk, and it was released on FDR's birthday in commemorative of our president who had polio and was the one who really rocketed forward the research in this country to try to develop a vaccine to stop it. Several years later, it was Dr. Albert Sabin who actually developed the oral polio vaccine, which instead of it being a killed vaccine, which is the one that was injected in the Salk vaccine, this was a weakened, attenuated vaccine that had been passed through monkey tissue several different times in order to weaken it. And many people might remember, at least historically remember, how it was given to children was the big lines up of children at school, and they were given a little sugar cube with a couple of drops of oral polio virus on it. So I think many people that are in their 50s or 60s, they remember the sugar cube of going through the line and getting that. Polio vaccines are touted as one of the major medical breakthroughs of the 20th century, but are they? Is it the same sort of issue that we sort of were looking at in terms of smallpox? There were some real problems with polio vaccines. In 1959, Dr. Bernice Eddy from the NIH was one of the main researchers of trying to develop a polio vaccine, and one of the issues that they had was that in order to develop the vaccine, they had to have a virus to be able to grow in a particular type of culture. And they used many different types of animal cells, many different types of cultures, until they found that the virus tended to grow and replicate in monkey kidney cells. Prior to that, they'd used several different types of cells that just simply didn't work. So Dr. Eddy was part of that research back in 1959. And what she found was that if she took the serum from that monkey, when the virus was growing in the monkey cells, if she would extract off the serum that those polio viruses were growing in and inject that serum into hamsters, approximately 70% of the hamsters developed tumors. And she was really concerned about that because when she extracted the tumors and looked at them under pathology under the microscope, what she found that there was a virus called SV40 that seemed to be growing the tumors. And SV40 is simian virus, monkey virus, number 40, because there were a lot of them that were found. But this particular one that seemed to be growing the tumors was SV40. Well, she was greatly alarmed, and she recommended that the vaccination program immediately be stopped until the vaccine could be researched farther and that they could find something that was safer than injecting serum as they were growing these cells. Well, her director and boss was not pleased. He was on a deadline. He was told to get this out. We had already been vaccinating now since 1955, which was when the Salk vaccine was released. And this was where she had found this, had to do with the Salk vaccine. And there were several different times of starts and stops during the development of the Salk vaccine that they could get the viruses to grow in culture in small quantities in laboratories. But when they put them into the big vats to be able to ramp up the quantity, it wouldn't grow, or there would be mishaps and things weren't working right. And she was really concerned about that. The director of the NIH was not pleased because with much fanfare and television cameras and all sorts of things, when the vaccine was released in 1955, there were now egos and reputations on the line. They'd been vaccinating now for 4 years, and millions of children had received this vaccine. How could they possibly retract it and say, oops, sorry, we made a mistake? But instead of being rewarded for her efforts and being able to save the children, Dr. Eddy's discovery lost her laboratory, her staff, her position at the NIH, and lost her career as a serious investigator. She was ousted. In 1962, a couple of years later, other researchers had concerns that SV40 in the polio vaccines was also capable of causing a variety of other cancers, not just tumors in the muscle, but other types of things. There was a study that was designed called the Framani study that was used to determine if there was a statistically significant increase in cancer in children who had been vaccinated between May and June of 1955. 2 months, that's it. Even though they'd been vaccinating since 1955, they only chose a very selected population of the very earliest vaccines to examine. In 1963, nearly half of the American population had received the Salk vaccine, and the NIH's own research had established the carcinogenicity of SV40. So the NIH itself had proven SV40 can cause cancer. Half of the kids in the country had already been injected by this vaccine by 1963. So they tried to take this study and they tried to develop a study to say, was this a statistically significant population? And like the studies that they use today to try to refute that the vaccine didn't cause autism, that mercury doesn't cause brain damage, they take these huge populations. So they take millions of people in the numerator. So if the denominator is really small, it's not statistically significant. Well, that's sort of what the Framani study did. And by 1963, JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, reported, quote, no significant alterations in mortality rates for cancer had been found, and the cancer mortality rates by the vaccine appeared to be unaffected, meaning that they were the same before and after the vaccine. So therefore, it couldn't have been, the vaccine isn't causing any problems. Closed case, done deal, not to be discussed anymore. Except for the fact that, like a lot of the vaccine studies that they put out today, there were some pretty significant flaws in the study. And when you really pull it apart and look at it, you can see where the Framani study actually laid the backdrop of what is used today for every vaccine study that they put out there to try to refute that vaccines cause any harm. For one thing, the children were only followed for 4 years, and SV40 cancers can take many years to develop. Only cancer deaths, not cancer diagnoses, were included in the study, meaning if children had been diagnosed with cancer but were still alive at the end of the study, they weren't part of the statistics. Only 3 types of cancers were surveyed, brain, kidney, and connective tissue, and we know, the NIH knows, that other types of cancers like mesotheliomas, leukemias, lymphomas, and all kinds of bone cancers can be caused by SV40, but none of those were included in the studies. And the leukemias and lymphomas going forward, as you read more about SV40 and all the things that they were caused, it was leukemia and lymphoma that SV40 was most involved with in terms of developing cancers further down the road. Flaws in the cohort assignment. In order to make a study have any validity, you have to have a control group, and that's what a cohort study is. You find a control group versus ones that have been vaccinated. There was an assumption was made that none of the children had moved from state to state, making it impossible to actually know who got the vaccine and who didn't. And so there wasn't any clear definition or definity between the ones that had had the vaccines and those that hadn't had the vaccines, and so the numbers were all mixed together. So the analysis of most vaccination studies shows that the data is inherently flawed or skewed, making the conclusions at best worthless and at worst very deceptive. The so-called landmark studies mislead the public into believing that vaccines are not a health threat, and misleads the scientific and medical community into believing that no further research is necessary. When one pharma study or government proclamation comes out to protect vaccines, other branches champion its conclusions in the form of a united front. It was the same in 1863 when we started promoting the wonders of the smallpox vaccination, in 1963 when we promoted the wonders of the polio vaccination campaigns, through 2009 when we say that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine has nothing to do with autism. We use huge epidemiological studies to prove that it doesn't. We use huge epidemiological studies to prove that mercury is safe in vaccines, even though if mercury is residual in a vaccine vial, it has to be treated as a toxic waste. We use it for the same thing to promote the swine flu vaccine of 1976, the swine flu vaccine of 2006, or the bird flu vaccine of 2006, and swine flu, and on and on and on. It's all the same. Anything to protect the vaccine industry and to make sure that we all get vaccinated, even lies and skewed studies. So that was the Salk's vaccine, which was the injectable. And the way I kind of remember the two of those and how I keep them together is that Salk has an L and IPV has an I, and they look kind of the same, and an I is an injection. And that's how from medical school I actually kept in mind which one was the Salk and which one was the Sabin. And the Sabin is oral polio vaccine, and there's like an O here in Sabin and an O here in OPV, and that's how I kind of keep them straight of which one is which. So the injectable is the Salk and the oral is the Sabin. It's estimated that about 1 million doses of oral polio vaccine causes 2 cases of paralysis. That's World Health Organization data, either in a vaccinated child or in a close contact to someone who has been vaccinated. So if your child gets a dose of oral polio vaccine and that oral live virus passes through the GI tract and ends up in the diaper and the stool, and the next person is exposed to that stool and contracts polio, that's called vaccine-associated paralysis, or VAP. Internationally, the World Health Organization has things called NIDs, which stands for National Immunization Days, which they take hordes of people, thousands of people who volunteer or work for the World Health Organization and troop across Africa and troop across Southeast Asia to deliver more than 430 million doses of oral polio vaccine over about a 2 to 6 week period of time. Parents have been known to take their kids and run into the bush. Parents have been tracked down at gunpoint and in third world countries and forced their kids to get these oral liquid drops underneath their tongue. In India, there are reported cases where these children had anywhere from 12 to 15 doses of vaccine because there's no written records like we keep them here in this country. So anything to get this polio vaccine out. The campaign potentially leaves, if you use the World Health Organization statistics and use their math, each campaign potentially leaves more than 800 children paralyzed just because of using the oral polio vaccine, if you just do their math. No records of children, and we've mentioned that some have received more than 20 doses. The World Health Organization stopped tracking the vaccine-associated paralysis in 2002. You can't really find it in their data anymore. The National Institutes of Infectious Disease admits that paralysis associated with the OPV is unavoidable, and as long as we continue to use the oral polio vaccine for eradication, paralysis from the vaccine will continue indefinitely. So we're just kind of chasing our tails with this. We're not really getting anywhere with the oral polio vaccine. And the reason that organizations such as UNICEF, the International Rotary Club, and other organizations spend billions of dollars and raise money and have campaigns for a drive to eradicate polio virus into extinction is to eliminate childhood paralysis, which is a pretty noble goal, no matter how unattainable it is, because non-polio viruses can cause a limp paralysis called acute flaccid paralysis. Families of viruses include Coxsackie viruses, Japanese encephalitis viruses, echoviruses, and other enteroviruses. And polio, as we know it, polio viruses are in the family of enteroviruses. So by eradicating this particular virus and having it not be around anymore, does not mean that we are going to eradicate paralysis worldwide. A lot of the information that I talked about at the beginning of this, to talk about the virus and the vaccine, came from this amazing book. It's called The Virus and the Vaccine, The True Story of Cancer-Causing Monkey Virus, Contaminated Polio Vaccine, and the Millions of Americans Who Have Been Exposed, by Debbie Bookchin and her partner Jim Schumacher. It's an amazing book. It reads like a suspense thriller. The first half is the history of the development of the polio vaccine, and the second half is about Dr. Michael Carbone from Loyola University, who tries to continue on with Dr. Eddy's work to expose the SV40 virus and causing all of these different cancers that we're now seeing showing up 40 to 50 years later, because it's a slow-growing virus. So from the beginning, we have paid and paid and paid for vaccines. The government pays to get them developed. The government subsidizes vaccine manufacturing. The U.S. government is the largest purchaser of vaccines, produced vaccines of any group in the world. The government underwrites the building of new vaccine plants. We pay public health department officials to run them and to make sure we're vaccinated. We reimburse doctors' offices and public health clinics to get us vaccinated. And we pay for all of those drugs through our escalating health insurance premiums. We pay for all the drugs to treat all the vaccine injuries that we see and all the side effects. We pay and pay and pay. It doesn't just stop with just the first shot. Remember this quote, the one from Dr. Tilden, who said that sooner or later when smallpox became obliterated, the credit will be given to the vaccination? Well, it's worth repeating, because it's also going to apply to when we no longer have little traces of polio viruses around anywhere in the world. Moving on to the next vaccine, which is the measles vaccine. And that was really put by Dr. Sam Katz. And after Dr. Katz, after completing his pediatric residency and a research fellowship in virology and infectious diseases, he worked with Nobel laureate John Enders for 12 years. And it was John Enders who was instrumental in developing the kidney cultures for the polio vaccine. And he was very, very involved in the development of moving the polio vaccine forward, and obviously that was Dr. Katz's mentor. Dr. Katz served as the chairman of pediatrics at Duke for 22 years, even though his career primarily focused on research and development of vaccines. He was a member and a chairman for ACIP for 11 years. And ACIP is the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices. These are a panel of, I believe it's 15 physicians, MDs, who are an appointed committee, not an elected committee. They are appointed committee and work through the CDC, and they are the ones who review the research. They're untouchable, can't sue them, can't kick them out, can't fire them, can't vote them out. They are an appointed committee who look at the research and make the decision of whether or not your child should be vaccinated with each new vaccine that comes down the pipe. Dr. Katz served on that committee for 11 years. He's been involved with the studies of Yersinia, polio, rubella, influenza, hepatitis B, pertussis, Hib, HIV, and many other vaccines. It's his passion, it's his life. He really believes it. He's a co-developer of the attenuated measles virus vaccine, has been credited for saving millions of lives around the world for developing this vaccine and holding a co-patent on it. So is he a hero or is he a villain? I guess it depends on whether you believe that the eradication of measles by this vaccine really was important in the trade-off for what we got instead. The measles vaccine, there are documented reactions from a single antigen measles vaccine developed from the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. So a lot of people who want to break that MMR vaccine up into single antigens, so you just give the measles by itself, the mumps by itself, rubella by itself, that really doesn't save a lot of injury. These are all the different types of reactions. These are brain reactions, is what subacute sclerosing panencephalitis is. And you see it, they call it MINE, M-I-N-E, which is an autism equivalent. Optic neuritis, encephalitis, encephalopathy, Guillain-Barré, transverse myelitis, all these horrible types of long-term, life-altering, permanent disabilities that can come also from the single antigen measles vaccine. And these were the measles deaths between 1912 and 1983. So the deaths in measles per 12,000 over there had gone down almost negligibly. The deaths had gone down almost negligibly before the measles vaccine had actually been introduced in 1963. And Dr. Robert Mendelsohn, who's a hero to a lot of people, who wrote the book, How to Raise a Healthy Child Without a Pediatrician, and has been around for a long time. It was a real crusader through the 50s and through the 70s for many of us. He said, quote, "I would consider the risk associated with measles vaccination unacceptable even if there were convincing evidence that the vaccine worked. There isn't. While there had been a decline in the incidence of the disease, it began long before the vaccine was actually introduced." So it's very important to realize that if your pediatrician or your doctor says if you don't get measles vaccine, MMR, your kid gets measles, they could die. Before the measles vaccine was even introduced in 1963, in 1955, the death rate from measles was 3 in 10 million before the vaccine was even introduced. So don't be afraid of measles, and that if your child gets measles, that your child will die. Katz also introduced the policy of injecting hepatitis B vaccines into newborns because he was the chairman of ACIP in 1991. When the 1991 position paper was written, it was like a 20-page paper, and the first time I read it, I couldn't believe my eyes. I actually had to read it 3 or 4 times before I said, this can't be it. This right here, this piece of paper, this study is why we are going to use hepatitis B vaccines in 1-day-old infants in this country, is because they have a high incidence of hepatitis B in Southeast Asia. They had a 10% incidence rate of hepatitis B in children in Southeast Asia. We didn't have that here in the US. That's the reason why we started doing it here. And because chronic alcoholics and people with HIV were refusing to get vaccinated for the hepatitis B vaccine because they didn't want to have that in their bodies. So all of a sudden, we now decide that it's okay to give it to 1-day-old babies. He admitted that there were no peer-reviewed published studies showing it was safe to be given to newborns that hepatitis B, and that the original studies were done on 5 to 10-year-old children. But then it was okay just to somehow take a 5 to 10-year-old and take it down to a 1-day-old baby. Between 1991 and 2003, there were 32,700 reports of reactions following a hepatitis B vaccine, including 618 deaths, 1,200 disabilities, 3,700 hospitalizations. Newborns have negligible risks for contracting the hepatitis B virus even when their mother is infected. I went to the first neonatal vaccination conference in Washington, D.C. in 2004, and one of the presenters talked about this, and they said that it appeared as though even if the mother had hepatitis B and the baby was born, when they tested the baby did not test positive for hepatitis B until the baby was 4 years of age, which to me is a reinfection. It didn't get transmitted from the mother to the baby. But yet, there's this whole theory that we came up with and we promote that if the mom's hepatitis B positive, we have to give the vaccine to the baby, and that has become standard of care. If the mom's not hepatitis B positive, dad's not hepatitis B positive, they still want to give the baby hepatitis B. Why? Because maybe mom hanky-pankied around with somebody before that baby was born, and they just might have hepatitis B. And I've had parents tell me that doctors have said that to them. Hepatitis B was added at birth in 1991. That was the same year the Hib vaccine was introduced. And when those 2 vaccines were introduced, the chart of the incidence of autism skyrocketed and started to go off the roof. In about 1994, they were having some problems with the manufacturer of the hepatitis B vaccine, and they backed off and stopped giving it at birth, and the graphs started to come back down. As soon as they fixed their manufacturing processes and got it back into giving it within the first 48 hours of birth, the incidence of autism again started to go up. And measles and the hepatitis B vaccine, measles vaccine developed by manufacturers of Merck, who also manufactures the hepatitis B vaccine, which is kind of interesting. And when Katz was the chairman of ACIP, he also worked as a paid consultant for Merck, Wyeth, and most of the other major manufacturers. Today, he remains on the advisory board of Merck and is an honorary member of ACIP. And when asked if his conflicts posed a problem, he said, "I think it's increasingly becoming a problem, but it's a perceived problem. It's not really a problem." How can it not be? How can it not be? The person who pays you hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, are you going to sit on that committee and vote against them? I don't think so. And the problems, these are the known problems with hepatitis B. These are the things that have all been reported in the medical literature to be associated with the hepatitis B vaccine. These are in children and in adults because hepatitis B is also given to adults that work on paramedics, that work in hospitals, that work in labs. These are all the things that we know for sure that the hepatitis B vaccine can cause. Low incidence of hepatitis B in the entire country, very high incidence of long-term disability, lots of drugs, lots of health care. Glomerulonephritis, people be on dialysis for years. How much does that cost on each one of those cases? We pay and pay. And if we didn't have vaccines causing all that stuff and making all those people be sick with profound hearing loss, neurotoxicity, seizure disorders, Henoch-Schönlein-Purpura, which causes kidney failure, in some patients Guillain-Barré, all of those things are lifetime disabilities. These aren't things like the flu that come and go, or hepatitis B that even if you get hepatitis B and you're exposed to it, only 20% of the people who are exposed are sick enough to even go to the doctor. So, and speaking of autism, since January 2008, virtually all persons and groups have at least considered exploring the possible links between vaccines and autism. These are all the different groups that have looked. All of these different groups have said, is there a connection between vaccines and autism? They're all funded by the drug companies, all of them. They're all part of the healthcare system, all of them. They all make their money off of vaccines and vaccine injuries, except for Thoughtful House, that tries to fix vaccine injuries and says, yes, I really do believe that there is a connection in at least some children. And even the Vaccine Injury Compensation Court has awarded millions of dollars to people who have been injured by vaccines. But all the rest of these people, all of them, all say there's no connection. And despite the General Medical Council ruling in January 28th of 2010 about Dr. Wakefield, who we're going to talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, I agree with Dr. Yazbak that when he says, the fact is that sooner or later, his theory that the live measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine is causing gut problems in autistic children will be accepted and vaccine autism connection will be proven. So that brings us to the next hero or villain. I mean, I personally kind of think that if you look at all the death and disability that's been caused by the measles vaccine and the hepatitis vaccine, I don't know if, you know, it's kind of a stretch for me to look at Dr. Katz as a hero, but I think that some people still do. And what about Dr. Paul Offit? He is the chief of infectious disease at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's the co-inventor of and holder of the patent for the rotavirus vaccine called Rotatech. He was on the ACIP committee from 1998 to 2003. He's been the author of several big-time pro-vaccine books, one about polio, one about autism's false prophets, which is really pretty interesting when that came out because he really wrote a lot about Dan Olmsted. And Dan Olmsted is a investigative reporter that writes for Age of Autism, and he's the one who actually uncovered the fact that the Amish population in central Pennsylvania are not vaccinated and there's no cases of autism there. He actually uncovered Mayor Eisenstein's practice, Home First in Chicago, that has 20,000 kids all unvaccinated and no incidence of autism or even asthma. And when Dr. Offit started to get into his book and talk about Dan Olmsted, he didn't even spell his name right. And Dan said, I just really couldn't read the book if he couldn't even really get my name right. So he was also asked, how can parents feel confident that doctors are unbiased and uninfluenced by pharmaceutical companies? Well, the conflict of interest issue is off point. I go through this all the time because I'm the co-inventor of the Rotatech vaccine. People think I must be evil. The reason I did it was to save lives. Well, we know from that rotavirus vaccine is a really mild infection, particularly in the US. and that most children by the age of 3 have experienced a rotavirus vaccine. And on the rare occasion when parents are unsure about dehydration and those kids get dehydrated, they end up in the hospital because of dehydration, not because they're going to die from the infection, but because they become dehydrated. And less than 20 cases per year of deaths from dehydration from a rotavirus vaccine happens in this country. So it's extraordinarily rare, and most kids get it and don't even have a problem from it. So saving lives, I'm not so sure. I think that's a bit of a stretch. It's true that I make money out of it as the co-inventor and the co-patent holder, and as the co-patent holder of a revenue-generating product, I make money. But it's like it's not like I co-invented the method to freebase cocaine. I mean, vaccines are a good thing. Well, I guess there's nothing improper about receiving compensation for a patented innovation. However, you know, Dr. Dan Olmsted has found that Dr. Offit personally makes somewhere between $29 and $55 million on his patent. And I know that he's refuted that and said it's not true, but he's not really come forth and said how much he does make. He just says that that's not true. So whatever it is, it's a lot of money. And it's a lot of money for a vaccine that really isn't important to have in this country. And is at reasonable risk for U.S. children, most of whom have had an uneventful rotavirus infection by the time they are 3 years of age, particularly when the vaccine side effects can be sounding an awful lot, just like by having a rotavirus infection. The side effect of the vaccine is diarrhea, fever, nausea, and vomiting. The other types of reactions that can be had, there's an association with an inflammation called Kawasaki's disease. There's another vaccine out there called Rotarix, which is a little different than Rotatec, but Rotarix has been associated with seizure disorders and deaths from pneumonia. Is it really necessary to give our children 3 doses of these viruses when children can get over this infection on their own by the time they're 3 years of age? So, who are, in my opinion, the true heroes? I would not say that in my opinion, because I'm staunchly opposed for anybody to have vaccines for almost any reason, is that Dr. Katz and D.A. Henderson and Dr. Jenner and Dr. Offit are really not, in my category, in my opinion, the real heroes that are out there trying to help kids and get them better. I think one of our true vaccine heroes is Dr. Archie Kalakarinos. Dr. Kalakarinos took his medical degree at Sydney University in 1951, and he spent 6 years in England. When he returned to Australia, he was appointed the medical superintendent at Calabari Hospital, and he served there until 1975. He observed that many Aboriginal infants became ill, and some died after routine DPT and polio vaccines, died almost instantly. He saw some of the Aborigines that had gotten flu shots, and as soon as they got flu shots, they almost died in front of his eyes. And he couldn't understand why that was. Well, what he found was that even when they were in extremis, by giving very large doses of oral and of IV or intramuscular vitamin C, he could bring them almost back to life. And much to his dismay, not only were the authorities not interested in this finding, that caused a dramatic drop in death in infants, many became extremely hostile and actually tried to run him out of medical practice. He will actually go so far as to say, and if you read his books and read the papers that he wrote during that period of time, that he thought it was absolutely genocide, that the people were actually trying to kill off these Aboriginal population, and that they really didn't have much access to any sorts of fruits or vegetables that had vitamin C. They were big meat eaters, and they ate lots of roots. And so it's because our bodies don't manufacture vitamin C, and even when we eat things with vitamin C, like apples and oranges and citrus, we don't store much vitamin C in our systems. And so when they would get these vaccines, there would be this huge inflammation that would go on inside of their bodies, and they didn't have the vitamin C to act as an antioxidant to squelch that cytokine reaction. He really is one of my personal heroes, and the books that he's written and the papers that he's written really sort of laid the backdrop to Dr. Mendelsohn and to some other people in our world that have looked at vaccines as really causing a lot of problems and exposing a lot of issues about vaccination. He said this, and this is one of his famous quotes: "The further I looked into it," meaning vaccination, "the more shocked I became. I found that the whole mass vaccine business was indeed a gigantic hoax. Most doctors are convinced that they are useful, but if you look at the proper statistics and the diseases, you will realize that this is not so." He was a very strong leader in the vaccine awareness movement and making people to wake up to see that there's another side of this story. My other personal hero is Dr. Andy Wakefield. I know Andy personally. I've spoken at a lot of meetings similar with him, and we've sat around and chatted several different times about things. And I just think that when he first made his discovery and published his first paper in 1998, that was not the first paper that he'd studied. He had been a researcher and he'd published many papers up until 1998. And he actually, when he did this, he felt like maybe there was going to be some bad things that came out of this, but he just felt it was a case report. In fact, when he published the article in Lancet on ileolymphoid nodular hyperplasia, nonspecific colitis and pervasive developmental disorder in children, which is a big old mouthful to say, that he had done endoscopies on 12 children who were severely autistic and had severe bowel dysfunction. And ileolymphoid hyperplasia is like having big swollen lymph nodes on the inside of your colon. And when they biopsied those lymph nodes and they actually looked at the material underneath a microscope, they saw what looked like particles of viruses, and they were able to say that those particle of viruses appeared to have come to match, they appeared to match the viruses found in the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. So he published it as a case report and said, isn't this interesting? Maybe we should look into this more closely. The paper's only 5 pages long. I've read it. It's just a case report. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of case reports published every single year in every medical discipline. And that's how medicine has moved forward over the last 150 years. Doctors would observe something in their research or in their clinical practices. They would write it up and publish it and share the information with other doctors. Then things would move forward. That was before the drug companies got completely involved in research and funding research. That used to be a conflict of interest to have drug company funded research. Now it's standard that any research is funded by Aventis or Merck or Eli Lilly or whoever. It's funded. Now, most of those studies are going to show positivity in terms of the people that fund it. His was just a case report. He didn't make any claims. He didn't say, I connect this bowel disease with autism. I absolutely say that the MMR is causing autism. It was simply a hypothesis. And it was there may be a connection in some children that have severe autism. There's also bowel dysfunction. If they have bowel dysfunction, that may be where they're having all this pain and all the diarrhea and all these things. And maybe there's a connection there. That's where that started from. Well, unfortunately for Dr. Andy, what he actually did was pick up a stick and poke it in the giant's eye, the giant being Merck. And that started a whole cascade of issues that have come forward for him over the last 12 years of scrutiny. On January 10th, the UK General Medical Council, which is equivalent to in the US to state medical boards, only state medical boards on steroids, ruled that he failed in his duties as a responsible consultant and went against the interests of children in his care, and concluded that he acted dishonestly, was misleading and irresponsible in the way he described research, which was later published in the Lancet. The Lancet rescinded his 1998 journal publication, and news stations, newspapers, and the internet buzzed with the news, and even by labeling articles of saying the anti-vaccine movement has suffered a serious blow. We can finally get rid of this character Wakefield, who did nothing but cause a lot of problems, caused the incidence rate of measles, mumps, rubella vaccination to go down, the incidence rate of measles to go up, and we can finally disassociate him and dishonor him, and maybe the rest of you people who think vaccines are bad are just going to shut up. Well, maybe. The one thing that they didn't really talk about in Dr. Andy's research was the other 20-some journal articles that had been published, that at least 4 other researchers had replicated his first study and said that, yes, there was measles virus found in the gut. They didn't say of all of the previous studies that he'd had, and somehow they've just decided to single him out. Consider other scandals that would have emerged in the scientific world. What about research published using fake stem cell lines? What about the studies of multimodal analgesia, who is said to have fabricated the results in at least 21 industry-setting articles dating back to 1996? Have you ever heard of Wang Wu-suk or Jean-Hendrik Schoen? I don't think so. They were the ones who published all the data on fake stem cells. Nobody heard about him anywhere in the news, 6 o'clock news, internet, anywhere. What about Dr. Scott Rubin of Bay State Medical Center in Springfield, Massachusetts, this anesthesiologist, whose data went back to 1996, and now the anesthesiologists are saying, we have an entire body of literature that we have been doing practice on for the last 20-some years, or for the last 15 years, or last 20 years, and we billed all these patients, did procedures on patients, billed insurance companies, did all these different things based on this Dr. Scott Rubin's research that he fabricated. Anybody ever hear about him on the 6 o'clock news? How many articles of his have been retracted? And what is the entire industry going to do since they have set up to follow him? But yet, we heard about Dr. Wakefield. It's one study that was a case report, and it was going to wipe out everybody who said anything bad about vaccines. Those were the researchers. They were not publicly crucified in the media. So I think with that, I think that I just wanted to put this as a historical backdrop of looking at the people that have created the vaccines that, in my opinion, have caused a lot of problems. A lot of disability, a lot of disease, a lot of drive behind the pharmaceutical industry. They're funded by the companies, they're consultants for the companies, they did research for the companies. And the couple of people who did research on their own and sat aside and have been trying to do things to get children well and to get parents to understand that there's other ways to stay healthy other than vaccination, I think that by seeing some of the characters in the play, I think that that's going to give parents a little different perspective on what has been happening and getting them and their families to this point. And I love Dr. Hadwin. Was another physician from the late 1800s who was a very loud, outspoken against vaccines, and I love this. I once believed in Jenner. I once believed in Pasteur. I believed in vaccination. I believed in vivisection, but I changed my views as a result of hard thinking. Vaccination has become a belief system in this country. It's a religion. And when you start to have a dialogue with someone who has a different belief system than you do, somehow they take that personally. And somehow we need to take the personalization, the belief in vaccinations out and look at what the research shows and see what we've traded. Have we traded infectious disease for long-term disability and chronic illness? I believe that we have. And if we can just talk about, when you start to talk about it with your friends and your family members, and you start to say things like, you know, I don't vaccinate my kids, why do people get all up in air with that? Why is it that if you turned around and said to them, but if I didn't give my child antibiotics, would you have the same reaction? If I said I didn't give my children vitamins, or I did give them vitamins, will we have the same reaction? Why are we so married to the belief system of vaccination? Which is something that I just want to leave people to sort of think about, and maybe with some hard thinking, some of those views will change. So I dedicate this presentation to the countless moms and dads who are victims of the vaccine industry, and all of these organizations that have done a lot to move forward the information that I've been sharing with you for the last 10 years on what is actually happening inside of vaccines, and why we need to think differently and why we need to do things differently. And I know there's others besides these, and I see I got a little bit of a typo up here. This is just vactruth.org. And these are just some of my friends and colleagues that have really worked really hard to repair vaccine damage, to get people to do some hard thinking about whether or not they're going to vaccinate going forward, and whether or not it is something that is really important, or whether it's something like bloodletting and leeches that maybe we should let go by the wayside. And when you get discouraged, don't give up. And on my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/vaccine-info, we have a lot of information that we share out there, and we support each other a lot. And there's a lot of parents who wish they wouldn't have vaccinated. There are a lot of parents who share things like, I didn't vaccinate, my kids are the healthiest in the world. There's a real community of people out there. And I want to just read you in closing, just a little thing that I wrote to my Facebook fans that I think that really applies. Because people get discouraged with this. You know, we have a belief system, a 200-year, multi-generational indoctrination that has happened with vaccination that is really hard to go against the grain sometimes. So I always talk about remembering the parable of the sower. Now, Jesus often told stories called parables to teach a lesson as an example to many. And many may be familiar with the biblical story, the parable of the sower. And for those who aren't, because they have different faiths or different beliefs, or they come from a different background, that's okay. Here's the parable of the sower. And I always personally like to keep this in mind when I spread the word and spread information about vaccines. And the story of the parable of the sower is simple and very powerful. And it goes like this. A farmer sows seeds in the field. Some seeds fall on the paths, and the birds quickly eat it. Some seeds fall on the rocks where there's not much soil. Plants grow quickly, but the sun soon withers them and they die. There's not enough soil to feed the plant and keep it growing. Some seeds begin to grow in a place where there are too many weeds. The weeds stop the growth of the plants, choke it out, and it dies. But other seeds fall on the good ground, and the plants grow well. And the farmer harvests these plants and sows the seeds going forward. So how does that apply to vaccine information? Well, this is like this. This is what I keep in mind when I get discouraged and how I just keep spreading the information. Some seeds will never take root. It's like the seed falling on the rocky ground. There are always going to be skeptics and know-it-alls and people who believe in the religion of vaccination and can never be converted. Save your energy, move on, go on to the next one. Let them come to their own decisions in their own time, and they may never get past where they are right now. Some seeds of truth start to grow because the truth resonates with them. That's like the seed falling on the rocky place, but there's not much soil. And if they don't take the effort to learn more, to go into more watching presentations like this, talking to other people, then the criticisms of others, the heat of a family member or a pediatrician will melt their resolve, and their resolve to not vaccinate withers and dies. Some seeds start to grow, but the seedlings are growing amongst weeds, maybe employers, co-workers, people that work in the healthcare industry, family members who are naysayers, who are all very strong pro-vaccine proponents. Discouragement sets in if they don't have another community to support them. And when that starts to happen, the weeds, the people that choke out their resolve, if they don't have enough root system, starts to choke them out and they wither and die. But some seed will grow and grow and grow and grow. Those seeds grow into massive trees, and that will give home to birds and protect the animals. Those massive trees will start an organization, be involved with holistic moms, get your community together, show a DVD at the library, or show something at your local church. That tree bears fruit and bears seeds, and it can actually then be planted in other places and grow more trees and share more seeds to multiply and grow. Now, the best case scenario out of that little parable is only 25% of your planting effort ever grows onto good fertile soil and grows trees that will bear fruit. But the issue is that you never know where that good soil is. It could be anywhere. So you need to keep spreading the seeds. And sometimes I think of myself in that way. I think of myself as Joanna Appleseed. I just keep throwing the seeds, throwing it out there. I just keep spreading the word, spreading the word. Some may fall on rocky soil. Some the birds are going to take it away. But I never know where it's going to really grow and bear fruit and trees are going to grow. I take full responsibility, and I take my responsibility of sharing this seed very seriously. But I stop at taking responsibility for the seeds to sprout. That's not my job. My job is to send that out there. And I send it out without expectation, because if you send it out without expectation, you won't be disappointed when the seed, with 75% of your planting effort doesn't grow. You never know where that seed of truth is going to be, and you never know where the next tree is going to grow. So keep this parable in mind. When you grow discouraged, if you've been doing a lot of seed planting for a long time, and it just seems that others just don't get it, because no matter what, I really encourage all of you to keep sowing seeds. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share this information with you. God bless, and keep sowing those seeds.
While the government says that
we could lower that.